Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take your curiosity, look at the sources you're digging into, and really pull out the key stuff. The goal is to give you a solid grasp without, all the overwhelm.
Think of it as your shortcut to getting up to speed on topics you find interesting.
Exactly. And today we're jumping into a really fascinating piece of history, looking at frankly, an incredible national transformation.
Yeah, this one's quite something. We're looking at how Japan went from being, let's say, technologically behind and largely isolated to a major world power.
And in just about 50 years. It's staggering. We're starting around 150 years ago, right with the beginning of the Meiji Reforms.
It really is an astounding speed. I mean, think about it. Within that short time, Japan built up the capability to actually, project power globally, even get involved in world wars.
It does make you pause. From this closed society to a global player, 50 years. So what kicked it all off? What was the spark?
Well, the initial push, the real catalyst, it came from outside, forcefully. Specifically, the arrival of an American naval commander.
Matthew Perry.
That's him, Commodore Matthew Perry, U.S. Navy. He sailed into Japanese waters in 1853. A pretty significant figure in American naval circles at the time.
He had quite a background, didn't he? Involved in anti-slavery patrols, the Mexican War. I read he even turned down an offer from the Russian Navy.
He did, yeah. Known as the father of the steam navy, actually.
And that's key, isn't it? The steam navy part.
Absolutely crucial. You see, America's interest in Japan back then wasn't random. Steamships needed coal, lots of it. And there were rumors, reports of coal mines in Japan.
Okay, so fuel was one reason. What else?
Whaling was big business then.
Yeah.
American whaling ships were all over the Pacific, often near Japan.
And if they got shipwrecked.
Exactly. There were incidents, American sailors weren't always treated well, and that became a point of friction, a concern back in the U.S.
And all this was happening while Japan was essentially closed off?
Pretty much. They had this policy called Sakoku, started way back in 1639. It basically banned most foreigners and stopped Japanese people from leaving. Kept interaction with the West to an absolute minimum.
Why did they do that? Fear of influence?
Largely, yes. Fear of European powers, fear of Christianity spreading, especially after some earlier difficult interactions with the Spanish and Portuguese.
But not totally closed, right? They still traded with the Dutch.
Correct. A very limited window was kept open with the Dutch at Nagasaki. Historically, that link was partly because the Dutch weren't Catholic, unlike the Spanish and Portuguese, whom Japan viewed with suspicion.
Okay, so fast forward to 1853. Perry shows up.
Right. Steams into Edo Bay, that's modern-day Tokyo Bay, with a fleet of warships. And his message was, well, blunt.
Something like trade with us or else.
Pretty much. Open up for trade, establish diplomatic ties, or face the possibility of conflict. It was classic gunboat diplomacy.
Using military muscle to get your way, basically.
Precisely. And Perry made sure they understood the muscle part. His ships fired off blank rounds, something like 73 cannon shots towards the city.
Wow. Just blanks, but still.
Oh, the message was crystal clear. Officially, it was time for American Independence Day, but everyone knew it was a demonstration of force, naval power.
How did the Japanese react initially? Panic?
There was definitely shock. And believe it or not, apparently some officials briefly considered sending sumo wrestlers down to the shore to try and intimidate the Americans.
Sumo wrestlers? Seriously?
Yeah, seems incredible, but it shows the gulf in understanding, perhaps. They quickly realized that wasn't going to work against cannons and steamships. The tech gap was just too obvious. So instead, Perry delivered this formal letter from the U.S. president, laying out the demands.
And he just left it there.
He said, basically, read this, think about it, and I'll be back in a year for your answer. He specifically mentioned June 14th, 1853 as the date he left the letter, a really pivotal moment.
Did he bring anything else besides warships in the letter?
Oh, yes. Gifts. Designed to impress, no doubt. A miniature working steam locomotive model, a telescope, a telegraph set, even some wine. A showcase of Western tech.
Huh. A little glimpse of the outside world.
Indeed. And interestingly, while waiting, Perry actually sailed over to Taiwan Formosa, as it was called then. He scouted it out, thought it could be a good coaling station for the U.S., didn't immediately lead to anything, but shows the strategic thinking.
It really paints a picture of the pressure. You mentioned Japan even had an old law from the 1600s forbidding trade with Americans.
Yes, a law from 1639. So here's the question, right? How much weight does a 200-year-old law carry when faced with a fleet of modern, heavily armed steam warships parked in your main harbor?
Not much, I'd imagine. It must have sent shockwaves through their whole system.
Absolutely. And to understand Japan's response, you need to know how power worked there at the time.
Mm.
Since way back in the 12th century, the real ruler wasn't the emperor.
He was a shogun, right? The top military leader.
Exactly. The shogun, head of the samurai class, held the actual power. The emperor's role had become largely ceremonial. This was the time of the Tokugawa shogunate.
So the shogun was the one who had to deal with Perry's letter.
Yes, and it was such a monumental issue, such a shock, that the shogun didn't just decide himself. He actually consulted with many of the powerful feudal lords, the daimyo,
Right.
and even, remarkably, consulted the emperor, which tells you how serious, how risky they viewed the situation. It also kind of highlighted that the shogunate's absolute authority was maybe not so absolute anymore.
And then Perry came back.
He did, and much sooner than the year he'd promised. He was back by February 1854.
Turning up the heat.
Definitely. And with an even bigger fleet this time, 10 ships, around 1,600 men. The pressure was immense.
So inside Japan, what was the debate? Fight or fold?
It split the leadership, really. There were factions, let's call them hardliners, who argued for war, expel the foreigners, maintain isolation, even if they knew, realistically, they'd probably lose badly because of the technology difference.
On the other side.
Others argued for a more, well, pragmatic approach. Make peace for now, open up, learn from the West, learn their technology, their methods, and then maybe later, when Japan was stronger, they could renegotiate or even confront them on more equal terms.
A tough choice. What happened?
This internal division caused huge turmoil. It destabilized the shogunate, eventually leading to basically a coup d'etat.
The shogun lost power.
Yes. And right around this time, Emperor Meiji died. His son, who was only 16, took the throne, Mitsuhito.
And he becomes Emperor Meiji.
Exactly. Later known as Emperor Meiji, the 122nd emperor. And crucially, the factions supporting the emperor felt this deep sense of, well, shame and humiliation over how the shogunate had handled the foreign pressure.
They wanted to restore the emperor's power.
Absolutely. Restore imperial power and prestige and fundamentally change Japan's direction. So in 1868, the last Tokugawa shogun officially resigned. Power was formally transferred back to the young Emperor Mitsuhito.
The end of the shogunate.
And the beginning of direct imperial rule. This period, his reign, was named the Meiji era, meaning enlightened rule. And it certainly lived up to the name in terms of change.
So what were the first steps of this enlightened rule?
One of the very first things was the Charter Oath. This was a statement issued in the emperor's name by his advisors outlining the new government's core principles. It became like a foundational text for modernization.
What did it say?
A key line, really the driving spirit, was about seeking knowledge throughout the world in order to strengthen the foundations of imperial rule. That idea, looking outward for knowledge to strengthen Japan, really defined the next decades.
So actively learning from other countries.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they looked closely at Western models. The Prussian constitution, for instance, was a big influence when they eventually wrote their own constitution. They started incorporating ideas like, freedom of speech, equality under the law.
A huge shift from the old system.
A complete overhaul. The old feudal hierarchy, the samurai class system, it was dismantled. The entire nation was mobilized around this goal. Modernize, strengthen Japan, catch up with the West, ensure Japan remained independent.
And the emperor himself. He wasn't just a symbol anymore.
No, Emperor Meiji played a very active role. Unlike previous emperors who were often confined, he traveled the country. He became a visible symbol of this new, unified Japan, which helped build national identity and loyalty.
They needed practical knowledge too, right? How did they get that?
A major effort was the Iwakura mission. They sent this huge, high-level delegation, top officials, scholars on a long tour of the United States and Europe.
What was their goal?
To study everything. Education systems, government structures, military organization, industry, technology. They were looking for the best ideas, the best practices they could adapt for Japan.
So learn from the West.
To eventually stand equal to the West. That was the plan. They knew they needed to become strong enough to revise those unequal treaties Perry and others had imposed when Japan was weak. It was a strategic, long-term game.
Were they just copying, though? Or adapting?
Very much adapting. They were careful to integrate Western ideas in ways that fit Japanese culture. Like when they introduced the Constitution, it wasn't just presented as a legal document. It was framed as a gift from the emperor to his people. That helped with acceptance.
What about the military? That must have been a massive change.
Huge. The samurai lost their exclusive right to be warriors. Instead, Japan introduced universal conscription.
Mandatory military service for everyone.
For men, yes. Initially for 4 years, this created a large, modern national army, not just a warrior class.
And they modeled it on Western armies.
They did. They looked very closely at the British Navy, which was the world's dominant sea power, and the Prussian, later German, army for their ground forces. They adopted their structures, training, technology.
But with a Japanese flavor.
Oh, absolutely. While the structure might have looked Western, it was infused with Japanese ideology, loyalty to the emperor, national spirit, Bushido concepts adapted for the modern soldier.
What about money? How did they pay for all this?
Another fundamental reform. They moved away from the old tax system, which was based on rice yields, to a modern tax system based on money and land value. This gave the central government a predictable, stable source of revenue. Finances were centralized.
Even daily life changed, right? I heard they adopted the Western week.
They did. The 7-day week, with Sunday as a day of rest. Apparently, there was some resistance initially. People were used to their traditional calendar, but it shows just how far-reaching these changes were. Almost nothing was untouched.
It's just incredible, the scope of it all. And did this influence other countries in Asia?
Definitely. Japan's rapid modernization became a kind of model, or at least a point of reference, for other Asian nations, Taiwan, Korea, China, the Philippines, who were also facing pressure from the West and trying to figure out how to respond, how to strengthen themselves.
It really is a powerful example of fundamental change, isn't it? The speed, the scale, going from isolation to a major player so quickly.
It's one of the most remarkable transformations in modern history. And of course, this period laid the groundwork for everything that followed for Japan.
Right. Victories against China and Russia, colonization, eventually World War I and II.
Defeat in World War II, and then that post-war economic miracle, becoming an industrial giant again. All of that has roots tracing back to the choices made and the foundations built during the Meiji era.
So let's circle back to the core question. How did they do it? What were the key ingredients?
Well, you had that external shock, Perry's arrival, acting as a powerful catalyst. It created a crisis, an undeniable need for change.
Okay, the push from outside.
Then internally, you had that political upheaval, the fall of the shogunate, the restoration of the emperor, which created a unified leadership with the will and the authority to actually drive change.
A unified vision.
And finally, and maybe most importantly, this incredibly deliberate, comprehensive program of modernization, actively seeking global knowledge, adapting it strategically, and mobilizing the entire nation towards that goal, all while forging a strong sense of unique Japanese identity.
A potent combination. What happened to Perry, by the way, after he opened Japan?
He was rewarded by the U.S. government, got a hefty sum, actually, wrote a book about his experiences, which became quite influential, played a big role in how Americans and the West came to see Japan.
Is it true there's a statue of him in Japan?
There is, yeah, in Yokosuka, near where he first landed, acknowledging his impact. And here's a final fascinating historical footnote.
The one.
The American flag that flew on Perry's flagship when he first sailed into Edo Bay in 1853. That very same flag was brought to Tokyo Bay in 1945 by General Douglas MacArthur, who happened to be a distant relative of Perry for the formal signing of Japan's surrender at the end of World War II.
Wow, that's quite a connection, spanning almost a century.
It really brings things full circle, doesn't it? So perhaps a final thought for you listening to this deep dive. Think about what it truly takes for a nation to undergo such rapid fundamental change. Are there elements of Japan's Meiji experience, the external pressure, the internal unity, the targeted learning that resonate with challenges or opportunities today? What can we learn from both the successes and perhaps the later pitfalls of such accelerated transformation? It's that complex dance between outside forces and a nation's internal resolve that really shapes history.